The bar buzzed with sounds from every corner of the galaxy. Alien voices blended into a strange harmony of grumbling, clicks, and hisses, each tone as unique as the beings they belonged to. The patrons, a colorful mix of scales, fur, and gleaming armor, filled the bar, huddling around tables, hunched over drinks, or murmuring in low tones. At the far end of the room, behind a long, battered counter, a tall, lean figure moved with quiet precision, a human bartender. He poured drinks, wiped glasses, and slid orders down the counter, a model of calm efficiency. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation in his work. He seemed to float through the space, dodging flailing limbs and sloshing drinks without a single drop out of place. His face was unremarkable, his expression neutral, almost detached, and his eyes were sharp and focused, flicking around the room as he took everything in with a practiced ease. Most patrons barely noticed him. To them, he was just another fixture in the bar, like the chairs or the dim, flickering lights. A human out here at the galaxy's edge wasn't exactly a novelty, but it was uncommon. Humans, after all, weren't known for thriving in alien-dominated territories. They were seen as outliers, even oddities, tolerated but rarely valued. The patrons who did glance his way dismissed him as just a bartender, a human who'd drifted far from his own world to pour drinks for creatures that barely registered his existence. But there was something about him, a subtle, almost imperceptible quality that made the most observant among the patrons pause. His hands moved with a grace that seemed honed over decades, steady and deliberate, with thin, faint scars tracing across his fingers and knuckles. His posture, though relaxed, was upright, alert, a stance not of a server but of someone trained to be ready for anything. And those eyes, always flickering, always watching, a silent testament to a mind that noticed every detail, every shift in the room's energy. He kept his interactions brief. When someone asked for a refill, he nodded or gestured, rarely speaking. Questions from curious patrons, especially the newcomers who wondered why a human was here at all, were met with short, neutral answers, as if words were a resource he had no intention of wasting. To those who pushed for more, his silence held a quiet warning, a subtle sign that prying too deep might yield answers they weren't ready to hear. Most patrons accepted the boundaries he set, if only because they were too wrapped up in their own lives to care. But rumors began to circulate among the regulars. "There's something odd about that human," a scaled creature muttered to its companion, its voice a rasp barely audible over the din. "He moves like he's, I don't know, unnatural. Too calm, too controlled." "Nah, he's just another human," its companion replied, waving a dismissive claw. "They're skittish things. Probably just trying to stay out of trouble." Still, the whispers persisted. Some noticed how he seemed to predict trouble before it started. He would position himself near rowdy patrons before they even had a chance to raise their voices, offering them a drink or a gentle nudge that diffused the situation before it escalated. Others swore they saw him dodge a blow from a drunken alien, sidestepping smoothly as if he'd anticipated it long before the swing. Despite the murmurs, no one pressed him too hard. The bartender was a constant, unchanging presence, a figure that seemed to blend into the background while somehow keeping the bar running with an efficiency that felt almost unnatural. Patrons came and went, and the days passed in a quiet routine. He was just the bartender, after all, a human who had somehow found his way to the far reaches of the galaxy, content to work in silence, fading into the background like the well-worn countertops and dented mugs. But it was those scars that sparked the most speculation. Thin, crisscrossing marks, faded yet unmistakable, lined his hands and forearms. To some, they looked like the remnants of machinery accidents, or perhaps the result of a rough life on some distant mining colony. But a few seasoned patrons, veterans who had seen battle and bloodshed, recognized them for what they were, scars from close combat wounds. Old, healed over, but telling a story of violence, of conflict that couldn't be entirely left behind. "He's not what he seems," an old, battle-worn alien remarked one night, its voice low and gravelly. "I've seen those marks before. Those are the scars of a fighter, a warrior." "Yeah? And what's he doing here then?" a skeptical patron retorted, eyeing the bartender with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "If he's so dangerous, why is he pouring drinks for a bunch of aliens?" The old alien shrugged, a knowing glint in its many eyes. "Maybe he's hiding. Maybe he's just tired. Sometimes warriors don't need battles. They need peace." The bartender ignored the stares and whispers, his focus unwavering as he continued his work. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, nor did he care for the speculation that swirled around him. His scars were reminders, but they were his alone. He was content to let them remain mysteries, silent witnesses to a past he had no intention of discussing. Then, one night, a particularly aggressive alien patron lurched toward him, its multiple arms waving wildly as it shouted something unintelligible. The bartender didn't flinch. With a single, swift motion, he stepped aside, letting the creature's arms slam down onto the counter beside him. Without a hint of irritation, he placed a fresh drink in front of the alien, who, dazed and momentarily subdued, blinked in confusion before retreating back to its seat. The display was subtle, almost too quick to catch, but a few sharp-eyed patrons noticed. It was as if he'd choreographed the entire encounter, knowing exactly when and where to move, guiding the alien's aggression away from himself with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. "He's more than he seems," one patron murmured, eyes narrowing in contemplation. But the bartender's calm remained unbroken, his expression as placid as ever as he resumed cleaning the counter, unaffected by the lingering gazes and quiet discussions that followed. To most, he was still just a bartender. A human with a mysterious air, sure, but hardly worth any real attention. He was, after all, just there to serve drinks, to wipe spills, to keep the peace in a way that left him unnoticed, unimportant. He was a human, a species many considered weak, unremarkable in a galaxy teeming with beings far more powerful, more advanced. Yet for those who paid close attention, a different picture was beginning to form. There was an edge to him, a controlled strength that lay just beneath the surface, hidden beneath layers of quiet and calm. It was the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself, that didn't boast or threaten, but simply existed, ready and waiting. As the night wore on, the bartender continued his work, his presence steady and unassuming. The bar thrummed around him, a cacophony of alien voices and clinking glasses, and he moved through it all like a ghost, unnoticed yet undeniably there. The rumors, the speculation, the occasional wary glance, none of it mattered. He was there for one purpose, and it had nothing to do with the whispers or the stares. To the rest of the galaxy, he was a human, a species better known for their short lives and limited abilities. But here, on the fringes of civilization, where the rules were loose and reputations were forged in silence, he was something else. A quiet presence with a history that lingered in every scar, every flicker of his eyes, every graceful motion that belied the calm surface he maintained. For now, he was content to stay as he was, just a bartender, a human among aliens, keeping his secrets close, his past buried deep. But for those who dared to look closer, there was a sense that he was more than he let on. The bartender's gaze drifted beyond the crowded bar, memories tugging at his mind, refusing to fade. He hadn't always been a fixture here, blending quietly into the background. Once, he was something else entirely, a warrior known across Earth, feared and respected, a legend whose name inspired both admiration and dread. The scars on his hands weren't from menial work or accidents. They were marks of survival from battles fought on Earth's soil, where every encounter had been a struggle between life and death. In his prime, he was a force, an unyielding defender trained to protect humanity against threats that loomed large. Flashes of his old life returned, each memory sharp and unrelenting. He could still feel the adrenaline from battles, the tension in his muscles as he confronted enemies in the chaos of war. It wasn't the faceless opponents he remembered, but the brutality, the exhaustion, and the weight of lives that had depended on him. He had been Earth's shield, the one others relied upon when the odds were insurmountable. His reflexes, honed to a razor's edge, and his strategic mind had saved countless lives, yet the burden of that responsibility had slowly chipped away at him. In the end, he'd been left as much a scarred relic as the Earth he'd defended. Back then, he was celebrated, his victories chronicled in stories, his actions inspiring younger recruits. His movements in battle were spoken of as if he were more machine than human, unfaltering, efficient, ruthless. But with each battle, each loss, the toll grew heavier. Earth had been in a state of near constant turmoil, a battleground for forces that sought to exploit its resources and subdue its people. He became a symbol, someone the enemies of humanity learned to fear, and even his own people viewed him with a mixture of awe and unease. But the more victories he claimed, the more he realized that he was losing himself, piece by piece, to the demands of a life that knew only war. When the war ended, he made a choice that stunned those around him. He vanished. The warrior who had been Earth's protector slipped away, refusing titles, honors, and the life of constant vigilance that came with them. There were whispers that he had retired, exhausted from the relentless battles. Some speculated that he died in one of the countless skirmishes, his body unmarked in any registry. But the truth was simpler: he'd chosen exile. He no longer wanted the mantle of warrior. He craved solitude, a space where he could escape the burden of what he had become. This bar, at the galaxy's edge, had offered the quiet he'd longed for. Here, he was unknown, just a human among the alien multitude, invisible to those who had never seen war or cared to understand it. The simplicity of pouring drinks, cleaning counters, and watching others lose themselves in stories and spirits was strangely comforting. He became the bartender, a role that allowed him to fade into the background, to be just another face in a galaxy that cared little for his past. Yet, he couldn't entirely escape the remnants of his old self. Despite the tranquility he tried to cultivate, there were moments when his instincts surged to the surface. In those flashes, he could feel the readiness in his muscles, the awareness that never fully dimmed, the quiet, constant vigilance. His movements retained the precision and control drilled into him over years of combat. Even as he worked in silence, part of him was always alert, scanning his surroundings, assessing threats, even if those threats were now little more than drunken aliens causing a ruckus. The scars on his hands, however faded, reminded him of what he had left behind. They were thin, almost unnoticeable to the casual observer, but for anyone familiar with battle, they told a story. They were the result of close calls, encounters that had pushed him to the limits of his strength and endurance. Every line represented a moment when survival had come at a cost, a price he had paid willingly but had grown tired of. Out here, among beings who didn't know his history, he could pretend that these scars were just that, marks of a past life that no longer defined him. Yet there were times when whispers circulated among the patrons, hints that some sensed he wasn't what he seemed. The most seasoned visitors, those who had seen violence and survived, occasionally exchanged knowing glances when they saw him handle himself with such silent confidence. They recognized the subtle signs, the way he anticipated trouble, the instinctive precision in his movements, the quiet authority in his stance. But none dared confront him about it directly. To them, he was an enigma, a human who had somehow chosen this far-off outpost over whatever life he'd left behind. He had come to accept that some part of him would always remain on edge, always prepared, even here where he should have been able to let his guard down. The habits he'd developed over years of warfare were deeply ingrained, impossible to shake completely. In his quiet moments, he wondered if true peace was something he would ever find. His life as a bartender might have offered an escape from the demands of battle, but it was no cure for the restlessness that lay beneath his calm exterior. The instincts that had kept him alive on Earth had not faded. They were dormant, waiting, a reminder of a life he could never fully leave behind. The most he could do was control these instincts, channeling them into the rhythm of his work. Every drink he poured, every conversation he avoided, every subtle intervention when things got too rowdy, all were outlets for the discipline that had once made him formidable. He learned to mask his reflexes in small, subtle ways, blending into the ebb and flow of the bar while maintaining the edge that had once defined him. Occasionally, his mind wandered to the life he'd left behind, the friends who had fought alongside him, the comrades who had fallen, the weight of the expectations that had once pressed upon him like a crushing burden. He had tried to convince himself that he could simply let go of it all, that he could leave behind the part of him that knew nothing but conflict. But in the depths of his mind, he knew that he would always be that warrior, even if the galaxy now saw him as just another face, just a quiet bartender on a distant outpost. As the days passed, he embraced the anonymity the bar offered, though he remained ever watchful, ever aware. He didn't mind the whispers, the occasional curious glance. Let them wonder. Let them guess. He no longer had to prove himself, nor did he have any intention of revealing the truth to those who would likely never understand. To the galaxy, he was a human who had found his way to a bar in a far-off corner of space. They didn't need to know more than that. But he kept his past close, a silent companion that walked beside him even here, at the edge of civilization. He knew that no matter how far he traveled, no matter how many years passed, he would carry his history within him, a legacy that had been etched into his very bones. Here, among strangers who neither knew nor cared about his past, he could live as a ghost of the warrior he once was, a shadow drifting through a galaxy that barely registered his existence. Yet, beneath the scars, the silence, and the calm, he remained vigilant. His senses sharp, his reflexes ever ready, he watched and waited, prepared for anything the universe might throw his way. And though he wore the mask of the unassuming bartender, there was a part of him that would always be more, a warrior whose legacy, though hidden, lived on in every quiet, steady motion. The bar was quieter than usual when the group of alien guards entered, their heavy footsteps sending ripples of tension through the room. Their uniforms were unmistakable, dark and imposing, symbolizing their authority and their tendency to intimidate wherever they went. As they scanned the room, their eyes fell on the bartender, and a smirk spread across the face of one of them. The bartender continued his work as though he hadn't noticed, calmly polishing a glass, but he had already assessed them, his mind shifting as he observed their movements. The guard who smirked stepped forward, leaning against the bar counter with a sneer. "You're the human, huh? Looks like you've found a nice little corner of the galaxy to disappear into." His tone dripped with condescension. His companions chuckled, and their postures radiated confidence, their body language practically screaming their disdain. To them, he was a primitive creature, a weak species that had somehow wandered beyond its means. They had encountered humans before, mostly traders or wanderers, none of whom had ever posed any threat to their authority. The bartender barely reacted, his eyes flicking up just long enough to meet the guard's gaze before returning to the glass in his hand. There was no challenge, no fear, nothing to give them the reaction they wanted. Another guard joined in, leaning in closer and muttering something derogatory about humans being fragile, their bodies too weak for any real combat. The bartender's hands continued their steady work, his expression as neutral as ever, showing not a single sign that their words affected him. "Look at him!" The first guard laughed, elbowing his companion. "Not even a flinch! Guess he's too dumb to realize we're talking about him." Their laughter filled the bar, but the bartender remained composed, as though he were oblivious to their taunts. But internally his focus sharpened. He had seen their type before, those who relied on intimidation, using their positions of authority to bully others. In the past he had confronted worse, far worse, and he had learned that the best response was patience, the kind of calm that unsettled those who didn't understand it. He could feel the tension building, but he also knew that these guards had yet to realize who they were dealing with. The guards weren't satisfied with his lack of reaction. Their expressions hardened, and one reached out, grabbing the bartender's arm, squeezing as if to demonstrate his strength. "Maybe you should learn some respect, human," he hissed, tightening his grip. The bartender finally looked up, his gaze steady, meeting the alien's eyes with a look that was both calm and unyielding. There was no anger in his expression, just an almost clinical detachment that seemed to catch the guard off guard. "I would suggest letting go," he said, his voice low but firm, devoid of any tremor. The guard sneered, tightening his grip further, trying to elicit some reaction. But the bartender's expression remained unchanged, his gaze as steady as before. It was only then that the guard seemed to feel something, a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere, like the calm before a storm. The bartender wasn't resisting, but there was a sense of restraint, a quiet warning that only the observant would have noticed. Some of the patrons, who had witnessed his silent, watchful nature over time, began to watch more closely, sensing that this wasn't an ordinary standoff. Another guard, noticing the shift, laughed. "What's the matter, human? Don't have the strength to break free? Or are you too scared?" They continued to laugh, oblivious to the fact that their attempts at intimidation were having the opposite effect. The bartender's silence wasn't weakness, it was a control that few of them could recognize. He was gauging them, observing every movement, waiting for the right moment. Then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible motion, he twisted his arm, effortlessly breaking free of the guard's grasp. His movements were so fluid, so practiced, that the guard stumbled back, looking both surprised and irritated. The bartender's face remained calm, his eyes fixed on the guard, who now felt a growing unease. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice faltered, a sliver of doubt creeping in as he met the human's gaze and saw something in those eyes that he couldn't quite place, a depth, a readiness that defied the guard's initial assumptions. "You're making a mistake," the bartender said quietly, his tone carrying a subtle authority that silenced the room. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement, delivered with the kind of confidence that only came from experience. The guards looked at each other, momentarily unsettled, but pride prevented them from backing down. They had their reputation to uphold, and backing down from a human was not an option. "Who do you think you are, giving orders to us?" Another guard spat, stepping forward. "You're just a human, a nobody out here at the edge of the galaxy. You're lucky we even let you serve us." The bartender's gaze didn't waver. "You don't know who I am," he replied, his voice steady, even calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel in his tone, a warning that cut through the bravado. The guards exchanged glances, irritation mixed with confusion. They had come in expecting compliance, fear, submission. What they hadn't anticipated was a human who seemed unfazed, someone who met their mockery with quiet strength. Seeing his words were going nowhere, the lead guard decided to take things up a notch. He drew his weapon, a small but deadly energy blade, and pointed it directly at the bartender. "Maybe a little lesson will remind you where you stand, human." The patrons gasped, some shrinking back in fear, but the bartender remained perfectly still, his gaze steady on the guard. The room was tense, silent, everyone waiting to see what he would do. But the bartender didn't react to the weapon. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his expression calm, his movements smooth and unhurried. "Put the weapon down," he said, his voice soft but with a firmness that cut through the guard's facade of confidence. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt in the guard's eyes. Something about the human's calmness, his lack of fear, was deeply unsettling. It was as if the bartender had faced far worse than a weapon pointed at him, as if he had seen enough violence to understand that this was nothing more than a desperate show of power. The guard scoffed, trying to shake off his unease. "Or what? You'll hit me with a glass? Maybe mop the floor with us." He tried to laugh, but his voice was strained, and the other guards shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the bartender's calm was more than just a bluff. In a swift, seamless motion, the bartender moved, disarming the guard with a precision that left him standing weaponless, dumbfounded. The weapon clattered to the ground, and before the guard could react, he was spun around, his arm locked in a hold that left him immobilized. It happened so quickly that no one had time to react. It was over in seconds, the guard rendered powerless in the bartender's grip. The other guards took a step back, shock and confusion written across their faces. They were warriors, trained enforcers, yet this human had subdued one of them without breaking a sweat. For the first time, they looked at him with something other than disdain. The bartender released the guard, who stumbled away, clutching his arm and staring at him in stunned silence. "You're out of your league," the bartender said softly, his voice carrying a finality that made it clear this confrontation was over. The guards exchanged looks, uncertain, shaken. They had come to assert their authority, but they left with their pride wounded and their assumptions shattered. As they retreated, the patrons remained silent, watching as the bartender returned to his work, his calm undisturbed. Those who had witnessed the scene would never forget it. The bartender, the quiet, unassuming human they'd thought was just another face in the crowd, had revealed a side of himself that defied their every expectation. In that moment, they saw not just a bartender but a man who carried the weight of battles and scars they could only imagine. He had confronted the guards without fear, without anger, using skill rather than force, showing them that true strength lay not in intimidation but in mastery over oneself. And as he resumed his place behind the bar, the patrons understood that they had glimpsed a part of him that few ever would. He had chosen peace, but he was a warrior at his core, a force contained, a strength hidden beneath calm. And though the bar fell into its usual hum of voices, those present knew they had seen something rare, something that changed the way they looked at him forever. The bartender returned to his duties with the same calm precision, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the air around him had shifted, carrying a weight of newfound respect from the patrons who had witnessed his quiet power. They now understood that the quiet human pouring drinks was anything but ordinary. Whispers rippled through the bar, spreading stories of what they'd just seen. Some speculated he might have been a soldier, others thought him an exiled warrior, but all agreed on one thing: he was a figure worthy of caution, someone whose strength was hidden behind a mask of stillness. As word spread, more eyes followed him throughout the night. Aliens who had once looked through him now watched him with reverence, their stares marked by a mix of awe and wariness. Conversations dimmed whenever he passed by, as if everyone sensed they were in the presence of something greater than they could comprehend. Some felt gratitude, understanding that he was now a guardian of the bar, someone they could rely on if things ever escalated. Others felt a tinge of fear, knowing that his power was something they didn't fully understand, and perhaps never would. The bartender, however, paid them no mind. He moved with the same fluid grace, indifferent to the whispers and curious glances. His purpose had not changed. He had come here for peace, and that was what he intended to keep. The confrontation with the guards was a reminder of his past, but he held no desire to revisit it. He wasn't here to prove anything, nor did he crave the respect that now lingered in every corner of the bar. All he wanted was the simplicity of his chosen life, a quiet existence without the weight of conflict. Yet, for the patrons, this newfound understanding transformed their perception of him. They no longer saw a mere bartender but someone carrying a legacy, a human who had seen and endured more than they could imagine. They began to show him subtle gestures of respect, nodding in silent acknowledgement, stepping aside as he passed, even leaving generous tips as tokens of gratitude. The bartender accepted it all with his usual silence, not seeking attention but no longer invisible, his presence now acknowledged by all who frequented the bar. One evening, a particularly seasoned patron, an old alien veteran scarred by battles of his own, approached the bar. He studied the bartender with a gaze that held more than curiosity. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes, the look of someone who recognized another soul touched by the same hardships. He didn't ask for a drink. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice to a respectful murmur. "I've seen those scars before," he said, nodding toward the bartender's hands. "Those are marks of a life hard-lived, aren't they?" The bartender met his gaze, offering a small nod. There was no need for words. The veteran's expression softened, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a shared understanding that transcended language or species. They were both warriors, both carrying the burdens of battles long past, and for that brief moment, they understood each other in a way no one else in the bar could. The old veteran offered a slight bow, a gesture of respect, and returned to his seat without pressing further. In that single exchange, an unspoken bond was forged, a recognition of strength and resilience that needed no explanation. The bartender's past, though hidden, had found a quiet resonance among those who had glimpsed his true nature. Despite his efforts to maintain a low profile, tales of his quiet power spread beyond the bar. Patrons carried the story to other stations, telling of the human who had disarmed alien guards without breaking a sweat, whose calm had silenced a room full of beings from across the galaxy. Some embellished the tale, transforming him into a mythical figure, a ghost of a forgotten warrior who had chosen a life of exile at the galaxy's edge. Others claimed he was a guardian, watching over those who frequented the bar, a silent protector who kept danger at bay. In time, the stories took on a life of their own, circulating far beyond the bar's walls. He became a figure of legend, an enigma whose past was shrouded in mystery but whose strength was undeniable. Travelers came to the bar not just for the drinks or the ambience, but to catch a glimpse of the human whose reputation had grown beyond measure. Some came out of curiosity, others out of respect, and a few out of sheer disbelief, seeking to verify the tales they'd heard. But the bartender remained the same, quiet, steady, an unwavering presence who served drinks with the same calm efficiency as always, unmoved by the myth that had formed around him. For those who came seeking proof of his strength, he offered nothing. He refused to entertain questions about his past, dismissing inquiries with a polite but firm silence. He had no interest in rekindling the life he'd left behind or proving himself to those who doubted him. His peace was rooted in his detachment from that world, and he intended to keep it that way. He had chosen this place precisely for its anonymity, for the chance to live quietly without the weight of his past bearing down on him. But even as he tried to distance himself from the growing legend, he couldn't completely sever the bond he felt with the patrons who now looked to him as a protector. There were moments when his old instincts resurfaced, not out of a desire for recognition but out of a simple, unspoken duty to those who had come to see him as a figure of strength. He became the silent guardian of the bar, a role he hadn't intended but one he accepted nonetheless. If trouble arose, he was there, ready to intervene with the same calm efficiency that had defined his life as a warrior. Yet he maintained his distance, never indulging in the fame that now surrounded him. To him, the stories were irrelevant, remnants of a life he had set aside. His focus remained on the present, on the simple tasks that brought him a sense of peace: pouring drinks, listening to the hum of voices, watching the ebb and flow of patrons as they came and went. The legend could live on in whispers and tales, but he was content to let it remain there, a part of the galaxy's tapestry that didn't intrude on his solitude. As the years passed, the stories continued to circulate, growing in detail and exaggeration. Some claimed he was a former general, a leader who had once commanded armies across the galaxy. Others insisted he was a bounty hunter who had given up his life of violence, seeking redemption in the quiet work of a bartender. The truth was simpler, but he had no interest in correcting the myths that had formed around him. In a way, the legends served a purpose. They kept those with ill intentions at bay, creating an invisible barrier that protected the bar from troublemakers and threats. To him, it was enough to exist in the present, surrounded by strangers who saw him as both a mystery and a guardian. He knew his past would always be a part of him, woven into his scars, etched into his memories. But he also knew that he didn't have to live within it. He could carry it quietly, letting it guide him when necessary, but never letting it define him again. The bartender was his identity now, and it was a role he embraced fully, a simple life in a far corner of the galaxy where he could finally lay down the burdens of his former self. And so he continued, a quiet, steady presence in the lives of those who passed through the bar. He remained a fixture, unchanging as the galaxy around him shifted and evolved. The legends grew, the whispers persisted, but he stayed the same, a man who had once been a warrior, now content to be a shadow, a ghost who watched over a little piece of the universe from behind a bar.